The countryside had a way of closing in upon itself at dusk, as though the hedgerows and oaks leaned closer, whispering their secrets to the encroaching night. Greystone Hall appeared suddenly from behind a copse of beeches, its long stone facade rising pale and watchful against the darkening sky. Windows glimmered faintly, like half-lidded eyes, and a curl of chimney smoke drifted upward, as if reluctant to leave. Tommy Beresford, at the wheel of their small motor car, gave a cheerful honk as they turned up the gravel drive. "Well, old thing," he said, eyes twinkling in the last of the sunlight, "if this isn't the very picture of country house drama, I'll eat my hat. Look at it. Brooding walls, sinister gables, the works." Tuppence, seated beside him with her neat hat tilted just so, studied the manor with more serious eyes. "I don't care for the way it seems to loom," she said quietly. And Harriet's letter was hardly reassuring. He chuckled. Harriet Winslow was always given to exaggeration. In school, she could make a missing handkerchief sound like the crime of the century. Odd happenings will probably translate into a drafty corridor and a creaky floorboard. Yet even as he spoke with his usual levity, Tommy slowed the motor car, for the atmosphere about Greystone was hardly the sort to be laughed away. The sun had dipped low, casting the drive into a copper gloom, and the hall itself seemed to absorb the twilight, its tall chimneys stark against the clouds. They drew up beneath the portico where lanterns burned in iron brackets. A butler, grave as an undertaker, emerged from the shadows to greet them. His face was long, his livery impeccable, and his voice hollow with formality. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, welcome to Greystone Hall. Lady Harriet awaits you." Inside, the air was warmer, though the vast entrance hall seemed carved from silence. Polished oak gleamed under dim chandeliers. A sweep of staircase climbed upward into shadows, and portraits of stern ancestors stared down from gilded frames. Tuppence felt an odd shiver as her eyes were drawn to one picture, a severe woman in Edwardian dress, whose painted eyes seemed to follow her with unblinking scrutiny. Lady Harriet Winslow came forward from a drawing-room, her steps quick, her face alight with relief. She was a handsome woman still, though anxiety had sharpened her features. "My dear friends," she said, clasping Tuppence's hands, "how good of you to come at once. I hardly knew to whom else I could turn." "Always glad to oblige," Tommy replied lightly, "though you'll forgive us if we reserve judgment until we hear what dreadful goblins have been haunting you." Harriet glanced nervously at the butler, who bowed himself away before she spoke again. "It isn't goblins, of course, but there are things in this house, things that should not be." She led them into a richly furnished drawing-room where firelight licked at the carved mantelpiece. Shadows clung in the corners despite the lamps. Harriet pressed them into armchairs, poured sherry with unsteady hands, and lowered her voice. "You remember my sister, Alice?" she began. "Of course," Tuppence said gently. "She died very young, did she not?" Harriet nodded. "And her little boy, Edward, he died in this house in the nursery upstairs. A dreadful fever, they said at the time. But ever since, her voice faltered, the nursery has been locked. My father would never allow it opened. He said it was better to leave the past sealed away." "Very sensible of him," Tommy murmured. Harriet's eyes flashed. "Sensible, perhaps, but the past does not stay buried. Lately there have been disturbances, whispers in the corridor, lights where there should be none, objects moved as if by unseen hands, and always it centres upon that room. The servants call it cursed." Tuppence leaned forward, her gaze intent. "And you, Harriet, what do you believe?" I do not know." She clasped her hands together tightly. "But last week I found a child's toy soldier upon the landing outside the locked door. Edward's toy. It was buried with him." For a moment the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Tommy cleared his throat. "Well, that is curious, I admit. But surely it might have been some forgotten trinket from another child." "There are no other children here," Harriet said firmly, "and the nursery has remained locked. I keep the key myself." Tuppence shot her husband a look that plainly said, "Superstition or not, this merits attention." Tommy responded with a half-smile that conceded the point without surrendering his skepticism. Their conversation was interrupted by a maid who slipped into the room, eyes wide with unease. She addressed Harriet in a whisper that was perfectly audible to the Beresfords. "Beg pardon, my lady, but the footmen, they will not go upstairs after dark. They say they hear crying." Harriet dismissed the girl with a sharp gesture, but the maid's words lingered in the silence like the echo of a bell. "I should not have troubled you," Harriet said, recovering some composure. "But I am desperate. My brother tells me I am foolish, that the house creaks and the staff are fanciful. Yet I cannot rest. And when I heard you were visiting friends in the district, well, I remembered how clever you both were in matters of investigation." Tuppence reached out and squeezed her hand warmly. "You did right to call us. If there is something amiss, we shall find it." Tommy raised his glass. "Hear, hear. We'll rout out the spooks, living or otherwise." Harriet smiled wanly, but the shadows in her eyes deepened. They dined that evening in a vast hall where candlelight struggled against the gloom of rafters high above. Portraits of Winslow's long dead stared down upon the company. Harriet's brother Charles, ruddy and dismissive, a stern governess named Miss Drake whose watchful eyes rarely left them, and a handful of distant cousins whose conversation faltered whenever the nursery was mentioned. The air was heavy with suppressed unease, the silver gleaming too brightly, the laughter a shade too forced. Afterwards, as the guests drifted away, Harriet led them on a short tour of the ground floor. The house was a labyrinth of corridors, panelled walls, and echoing chambers. In one passage, Tuppence caught the whisper of servants talking hurriedly before falling silent at her approach. She caught only a fragment. "Never open that door." The staircase loomed again, its carpet darkened with age. Harriet paused at the foot and gestured upward. "The nursery lies there, at the end of the east wing corridor. The key is here." She touched the chain at her waist, from which a small iron key dangled. "But I have not dared to use it." A hush pulled on the stair. For several heartbeats the house seemed to listen with them. Tommy tilted his head, curiosity sparking despite his skepticism. "And if one did dare?" Harriet's lips trembled. "Then one would hear the truth, and I'm not sure I wish to hear it." Before Tuppence could reply, a sound shattered the stillness. From upstairs, sharp and sudden, came a scream, piercing, terrified, cut short as if by a hand across the mouth. Harriet gasped, the colour draining from her face. Servants froze in the corridor, eyes wide with dread. Tommy and Tuppence exchanged a swift glance of alarm. Without another word, Tommy bounded up the staircase 2 steps at a time, Tuppence close at his heels, while Harriet clutched at the banister below. The echoes of that scream lingered in the air of Greystone Hall, as though the house itself had cried out, and the silence that followed was more terrible than any sound. A minute after the scream, they had reached the east wing. The house had not yet drawn breath again. The echo of that scream still clung to the air when Tommy reached the landing, his shoes thudding against the carpeted steps. Tuppence came behind, her lighter tread urgent but steady. The corridor stretched long and dim before them, sconces casting uncertain pools of lamplight, and at the very end loomed the nursery door, bolted, silent, forbidding. Tommy's voice was low but sharp. "Did it come from there?" Tuppence nodded, pressing a hand to her breast. It couldn't have been anywhere else. They approached with caution. The air seemed thicker near the nursery, as though the house itself held its breath. A faint draught whispered down the passage, and then, distinct though muffled, came the murmur of voices. Whispering, sibilant, the cadence unmistakable, yet the words indistinct. Tommy raised his brows. Either the servants are playing pranks, or we've stumbled into a séance. He rattled the handle. It did not yield. The iron bolt above was firmly in place. With a decisive tug, he tested the door again, still locked tight. The whispers ceased as abruptly as if a curtain had fallen. Silence pressed in, broken only by the distant ticking of a grandfather clock downstairs. "Tommy," Tuppence whispered, eyes wide. "If no one can enter, how can anyone be inside?" He gave the bolt a final tug, frowned, and stepped back. "A neat trick, one I don't altogether care for." Lady Harriet came hastening up, pale as parchment, her brother Charles following with lumbering steps, and impatience writ large across his florid face. "What is it?" Harriet gasped. Tommy gestured at the door. "We heard voices within, the doors locked fast, yet clear as anything." Charles let out a harsh laugh. "Nonsense. This house is full of draughts and echoing beams. You city folk hear a mouse in the walls and imagine it quoting Shakespeare." but Harriet's hands trembled as she touched the bolt, assuring herself of its solidity. It cannot be. I keep the key myself. She drew out the iron key that hung from her chain. With a breath she slid it into the lock, turned it, and pulled open the heavy door. The nursery yawned before them, dark and stale with the dust of years. A single moonbeam through half-shuttered curtains fell across a faded rocking horse, its painted eyes dulled. A small cot stood against the wall, covered in a moth-eaten coverlet. Toys, long forgotten, lay in heaps. The air smelt of age and neglect, yet there was no sign of recent occupation, no voice, no whisper. Harriet faltered on the threshold, unwilling to step across. Tommy, less reverent, strode in and surveyed the chamber. His hand brushed dust from a doll's cracked face. It left his palm grey. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. Tuppence bent suddenly and gave a small exclamation. At the threshold, half hidden by the door, lay a broken toy soldier. Its painted uniform was chipped, its arm missing. She lifted it carefully. "Harriet, this is one of Edward's?" Harriet's face drained of colour. "Yes, he had a set of them. They were buried with him." Charles scoffed again. "Or misplaced years ago. A servant child could have found it and left it lying here. Honestly, Harriet, you conjure spectres from dust." But his bluster rang hollow in the uneasy silence. As they withdrew, Tommy pocketed the soldier. "Evidence is shy," he said quietly, slipping it into his pocket. "I don't fancy it lying about for another shriek to be pinned on." Downstairs the household gathered, tension hanging like fog. Charles poured himself a heavy brandy, muttering about hysterics. The governess, Miss Drake, sat prim and straight-backed, her sharp eyes darting from face to face. Young Robert Winslow, Harriet's son, a tall youth with an air of nervous dignity, stood apart, twisting his hands together. Tuppence observed them all with her characteristic mixture of sympathy and shrewdness. She crossed to Robert. "It must be difficult, all this," she said kindly. He gave a strained smile. "My mother is overwrought. She shouldn't dwell on the past." "Do you believe something unnatural is happening?" she asked. His eyes flickered. "I believe the house is old, and the staff fanciful, nothing more." But his tone lacked conviction. Meanwhile Tommy engaged Miss Drake. "You've been here long?" "Since Lady Harriet's marriage," she replied crisply. "I was governess to her sister's child before that. I know this house and its people as well as anyone." "And the nursery?" Her lips thinned. "Locked as it should be. Memories should be kept in their place." "Yet you heard the scream?" "Everyone did. Sound travels strangely in this house." She folded her hands with finality. Tuppence returned to Harriet, who sat pale and tense. "You must see, Harriet, the whispers, the scream. They're not mere superstition. Something is happening." Harriet nodded, pressing her handkerchief to trembling lips. "And always, it is Edward's room, as though he still calls to us." Charles slammed down his glass. "Rubbish. The boy died of fever. It was tragic, yes, but nothing more. We must not encourage this folly." Robert flinched at his uncle's vehemence, and Tuppence noted it. Fear there. Fear of truth, or of exposure. Later, when the household dispersed, Tommy and Tuppence lingered in the corridor outside the nursery once more. The door was firmly bolted again, the key replaced upon Harriet's chain. The silence seemed too absolute, the shadows too deep. Tuppence touched the toy soldier in Tommy's pocket. "If Harriet is right, and no one has been here for days, how do you explain it?" Tommy frowned. "I don't. Not yet. But voices don't come from dust, and toys don't walk themselves upstairs. Someone wants this house uneasy." Her hand slipped into his, steady and sure. "Then we must find out who, and why." And as they turned back toward the flickering lamps of the staircase, the nursery door loomed behind them, mute and inscrutable, holding fast to its riddle. The following evening, the great dining hall of Greystone Hall had always been meant to impress, perhaps even intimidate. Its ceiling soared upward into shadowed beams, and ancestral portraits lined the walls, their gilded frames catching the light of innumerable candles. Long tapers burned down the length of the table, their flames trembling faintly in the draughts that wandered through the cavernous room. Silverware gleamed, crystal glasses sparkled, but the assembled company might as well have been dining in a crypt for all the warmth in their expressions. Tommy pulled out a chair for Tuppence, seating her beside Lady Harriet. Across from them sat Charles Winslow, red-faced and scornful, his heavy hands drumming irritably against the linen. At the far end, Miss Drake the governess perched with upright severity, her sharp features rendered harsher in candlelight. Young Robert shifted in his chair with restless energy, while the curate, a thin, pale fellow introduced as Mr. Ellison, twisted his napkin as though it were a problem he couldn't quite solve. Servants glided silently at the edges, eyes lowered, yet Tommy had the distinct impression they missed nothing. The meal began with strained formality, soup too hot, fish too delicate, conversation brittle as glass. Harriet strove for brightness, asking about the weather, about neighbours, about anything that might keep the evening ordinary. But the manor itself conspired against her. The draught rattled a shutter, and the chandelier chains gave a faint metallic sigh. Shadows trembled across the table like restless phantoms. It was Charles who broke first. He leaned forward, brandy already warming his tone, and declared, "This nonsense about the nursery must stop. Harriet, you've filled your head with old wives' tales, and now the staff follow suit. You'll ruin the household if you go on pandering to this hysteria." Harriet's hand shook as she set down her spoon. "You heard the scream last night as clearly as I. Were we all imagining it?" "A cat in the rafters, a servant shrieking at shadows," Charles retorted. "I won't have it discussed further." Miss Drake's hand slipped and a glass toppled against the china, shattering into glittering shards. She flushed crimson, stammering apologies as a footman hastened to clear the wreckage. Tommy caught the quick dart of her eyes toward Harriet, fearful, almost warning, and filed the detail away. Tuppence, ever the diplomat, leaned across with a gentle smile. "The country does lend itself to fanciful notions. In town one dismisses a creak as a loose board. Here it becomes a spectre. But surely, Miss Drake, you of all people know the difference." The governess dabbed her lips with a napkin. "Children have active imaginations, Mrs. Beresford, and those who tend them must sometimes shoulder the burden of those fancies. Yet I assure you, my own imagination is not so easily led." The curate cleared his throat timidly. "If I may." His thin voice faltered under Charles's glare, but he pressed on. "Scripture does not forbid us to believe that spirits linger where great sorrow fell. I have heard villagers speak of the child walking again." At this, one of the maids at the side table gave a stifled gasp, murmuring something under her breath. Another servant hushed her, but the words carried, "the child walking again." A chill fell over the table like a dropped veil. Harriet turned white. Robert shifted uneasily, his eyes fixed on his plate. Charles exploded. "Enough! I will not have ignorant superstitions spread in my house." "Your house, Charles?" Harriet's voice was suddenly sharp, edged with years of suppressed bitterness. "Greystone is mine by inheritance, not yours. Do not presume." Silence rang. Even the clink of cutlery ceased. Charles's face grew crimson, but he said nothing, only drained his glass with a savage swallow. Tommy, sensing the tension, remarked lightly, "Extraordinary how families bring out the best in one another. One almost forgets we came down merely for dinner." His levity earned a flicker of amusement from Tuppence and a grateful glance from Harriet, but it did little to ease the tautness in the room. Courses came and went, pheasant under glass, roast vegetables, syllabub sweet enough to cloy the tongue, yet no one seemed to taste a thing. Conversation lurched from strained politeness to bursts of sharpness, like a carriage jolting on broken wheels. Tuppence set herself to gentle probing, her tone mild, her questions seemingly harmless. She asked Robert about his studies. He stammered about Oxford, about hopes of the law, but his eyes darted nervously whenever Harriet's gaze lingered on him. She asked Miss Drake whether she planned to remain long at Greystone. The governess replied stiffly that her duty kept her where she was needed. Tuppence asked Charles about his estate, and he boomed about tenants and crops with all the enthusiasm of a man desperate to avoid other topics. Each reply, each glance she stored away as carefully as jewels in a casket. The curate, meanwhile, continued to wring his napkin, speaking only when pressed. He confessed to an interest in the unseen, and babbled nervously about villagers' tales of lights at the lake, of songs in the night. His manner was earnest, almost boyish, and Tuppence marked him as naive rather than sinister. A red herring, perhaps, cast in too deliberately to be ignored. When at last the meal concluded and the company drifted toward the drawing room for coffee, a hush of relief seemed to settle. Harriet lingered by the fire, her hands clasped tightly, while Charles sulked over his brandy. Miss Drake resumed her needlepoint with studied composure. Robert escaped into a corner with a book he did not read. The curate gravitated to Tuppence, murmuring about faith and fear, but she let his words wash past, her eyes keen on the rest of the company. It was Tommy who made the next discovery. Wandering the hall in search of a cigar, he happened upon a small cabinet tucked into an alcove near the library door. Its lock had been forced, crudely, recently. He beckoned Tuppence with a tilt of his head. Together they examined it by the discreet glow of a lamp. Inside lay a scatter of old papers, letters browned with age, deeds and family records. Someone had rifled through them, leaving the heap disorderly. Tuppence lifted a brittle sheet, squinting at faded ink. Correspondence between Harriet's father and the local solicitor. Nothing of note unless one looks closely. See here, Tommy. Mentions of guardianship, of inheritance, and all dated the year Edward died. Tommy replaced the paper, his eyes narrowing. Someone has been looking for something dangerous enough to risk discovery. They closed the cabinet quietly, returning to the drawing room as if nothing were amiss, yet both carried with them the unmistakable weight of suspicion. Harriet looked up, her face drawn. "All is well." "All is very well," Tommy assured her cheerfully. But to Tuppence, under his breath, he murmured, "Our haunting grows more human by the minute." Tuppence's eyes met his, shining with the thrill of pursuit. "Yes, Tommy, and I believe our ghosts have secrets worth unearthing." The candles guttered in their sconces as a draught swept through the hall. Beyond the windows, the night deepened, black and starless. And somewhere in the house the silence waited, heavy, expectant, as though listening for the next whisper to disturb its watch. Night laid its heavy cloak upon Greystone Hall. Beyond the mullioned windows, the countryside sank into silence, save for the distant sigh of the wind through the trees. Inside, the manor was still, the lamps extinguished, the hearths reduced to embers. It was the kind of silence that seemed to listen back, every creak of a board magnified, every sigh of a rafter made uncanny. Tuppence lay wakeful in the guest chamber she shared with Tommy, her thoughts circling the strange events of the evening. Harriet's pale face, Charles's angry bluster, Miss Drake's broken glass, the whispered words of the servants, each detail clung to her like burrs. Sleep would not come. And then, through the hush, she heard it. A sound so faint it might have been her own imagination, the lilting murmur of a lullaby. The tune was fragile, almost broken, but unmistakable, a child's cradle song drifting from somewhere along the east wing corridor. Tuppence sat upright, every nerve taut. The sound rose, fell, then faded as though carried by a wandering breeze. She touched Tommy's shoulder. "Tommy, listen." He stirred, half asleep. "What is it now? A mouse singing hymns?" "Hush, there." He blinked awake. The lullaby came again, a soft thread of melody winding through the darkness. Tommy's humour faltered. He swung his legs from the bed. "Well, that's not precisely mice." Together they slipped into dressing gowns, lit a candle, and stepped into the corridor. The flame cast long shadows along the panelling, and the carpet hushed their footsteps. The music ceased abruptly, leaving only the faint rustle of curtains at the far end. The nursery door loomed in darkness. It was firmly shut, the iron bolt fastened. Tuppence's breath caught as she laid a hand against it, half expecting to feel vibration from the song within. But there was nothing, only cold wood. Then Tommy noticed something else. "Look!" The corridor window, just beyond the nursery, stood unlatched. The night air poured in, damp and chill. The sill glistened faintly, and when Tommy held the candle closer, they saw it. Footprints. Small, wet marks trailed across the balcony outside, the toes pointing outward as though someone, or something, had walked away from the house. Tuppence drew a sharp breath. But how can they end so suddenly? For indeed, after a few paces, the prints vanished into nothingness, as though the figure had dissolved into the air. Tommy frowned. No ladder, no rope, a fine trick, unless our phantom sprouted wings. Tuppence hugged her dressing gown closer. "It's deliberate. Someone is staging these things. But for what purpose?" He gave a crooked smile. "Keep your chin up, old girl. If the spook means to frighten us, they'll have to do better than a few damp footprints." Yet behind the humour, his eyes were sharp, measuring each detail with the instincts of a soldier-turned-detective. They closed the window and withdrew, intending to search more in the morning. But the night was not finished with them. As they turned back along the corridor, a faint glow flickered ahead. A figure moved, candle in hand. Miss Drake. The governess glided silently, her expression unreadable, her nightrobe austere as her day dress. At the sight of them she started, nearly dropping her candle. "Mrs. Beresford! Mr. Beresford! What on earth are you doing wandering the halls at this hour?" Tommy folded his arms. "The same might be asked of you, Miss Drake. Insomnia?" Colour rose in her cheeks. "Indeed. I often find walking eases the mind. Surely there is no crime in that." "None at all," Tuppence said mildly, "though some might wonder why your hands are blackened. Soot, isn't it?" Miss Drake glanced down, hastily clasping her hands together. Tuppence's glance flicked just once toward the library chimney. "Of course," Tuppence said smoothly, though her eyes did not leave the governess's face. Miss Drake lifted her chin with sudden defiance. "It is late, and Lady Harriet values her guests' rest. I suggest we all return to our chambers." Without waiting for reply, she swept past, her candle trailing shadows along the walls. Tommy and Tuppence watched her go, the silence resettling behind her. "Well," Tommy said at last, "if that was insomnia, I'm a Dutchman. What do you make of it?" Tuppence lowered her voice. She was hiding something. That soot was fresh, and her story was too quick. "Agreed. She's up to something in those fireplaces. But what could be concealed there?" Tuppence's gaze strayed toward the nursery door once more. "Whatever it is, Tommy, it has to do with Edward's death. Every thread leads back to that room." He tucked the candle close, his face set. "Then we'd best start tugging at those threads, carefully." They returned to their chamber, but sleep proved elusive. For Tuppence, the echo of the lullaby haunted her ears long after the sound itself had ceased, as though a child's voice still sang from behind the locked door. And for Tommy, the image of soot-stained hands and vanishing footprints sketched itself into the ledger of his suspicions, waiting for the reckoning to come. The night dragged slowly, hour by hour, until at last the grey wash of dawn touched the windows, and Greystone Hall stirred again. But both Beresfords knew the house was far from waking to peace, for in its heart lay the locked nursery, and the lullaby that had vanished into silence. The morning after the lullaby broke with a deceptive gentleness. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows of Greystone Hall, gilding the stone floor and painting long rectangles of brightness across the Persian rugs. Birds called faintly in the distance, and the roses in the garden bowed with dew. Yet beneath that veneer of peace, the memory of the night's lullaby and the apparition of footprints lingered like a bruise beneath the skin. Tuppence sat at the breakfast table, her tea untouched, watching the governess with deliberate interest. Miss Drake entered precisely at the stroke of 9, as rigid as a sentinel, her dark dress severe against the golden morning. She greeted no one beyond the briefest of nods and settled into her chair with that air of permanent disapproval that seemed to be her armour. "Good morning," Tuppence said brightly, as though nothing at all was amiss. "I do hope you slept better than I." The governess's lips tightened. "I slept adequately, Mrs. Beresford. One must not allow oneself to be disturbed by fancies." Tommy chuckled over his bacon. "I've always thought insomnia the preserve of detectives and poets, and perhaps conspirators. Do you fall into one of those categories, Miss Drake?" Her eyes flashed, but she said nothing. Tuppence leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You were once in service to Lady Harriet's sister, were you not?" The governess's fork paused mid-air. "Who told you that?" "No one," Tuppence replied lightly. "But I observe things. The way you speak of Edward, the child. There's knowledge there that comes only from the intimacy of a nursery. You tended him." Miss Drake set her fork down with precise care. "Yes, I was governess to Master Edward. A sweet boy, too delicate for this world." Her voice faltered, and for a fleeting moment the mask of severity slipped, revealing a depth of sorrow, or guilt, that startled even Tommy. Tuppence pressed gently. "Delicate or endangered?" The governess stiffened, colour draining from her cheeks. "You speak wildly, madam. The boy died of fever. That is all." "But is it?" Tuppence's voice was soft, coaxing. "Last night you walked the halls with soot on your hands. You know something of the past, something that has not been spoken. What is it you fear?" Miss Drake's eyes darted toward Harriet, who had entered late, pale and wan from sleeplessness. "I fear nothing," the governess said quickly, her voice regaining its iron edge. "And I will speak no further of things best left buried." Harriet sank into her chair with a sigh. "Miss Drake is right in one sense. Some matters are too painful to revisit. Yet I cannot remain silent. The truth will out sooner or later." She reached into the pocket of her gown and withdrew a folded scrap of paper. "I found this beneath my door last week." She passed it to Tuppence. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic. "The child was never meant to die." Tommy whistled softly. "Well, that puts a kink in the story. Someone's out to reopen old graves." Harriet's voice trembled. "I have received 2 such notes. No signature, no hint of their author, but they drive a dagger into my heart." Charles, who had appeared in time to hear the end of her words, snatched the paper and crumpled it in his fist. "Rubbish. Anonymous scrawls meant to frighten you. You encourage this nonsense by indulging it." "Do you deny it could be true?" Tuppence asked smoothly. "I deny nothing because there is nothing to deny. My nephew died of fever. The doctor certified it. What more do you want?" His eyes blazed with an anger too quick, too defensive. Miss Drake rose abruptly. "I shall see to the accounts," she said, her voice clipped. With a stiff curtsy, she left the room. Tommy watched her go, his brows lifting. Well, she's rattled, and rattled people often drop crumbs behind them. After breakfast, Tommy and Tuppence contrived to follow her discreetly through the echoing corridors. She entered the library, her figure stiff and purposeful. When they joined her moments later, she was bent over a desk, shuffling papers that looked suspiciously like she had just retrieved them from a drawer. "Miss Drake," Tommy said casually, "if you know something about the boy's death, now is the time to speak." She turned, eyes blazing. "I told you, he died of fever. Leave me be." "But you hint otherwise," Tuppence said gently. "Your heart betrays what your lips deny." Miss Drake's mouth opened, then closed again. Her hands trembled against the desk. "If I spoke, it would destroy everything. Lady Harriet could not bear it." Before Tuppence could coax further, Harriet herself appeared in the doorway, her face stricken. "Please, Miss Drake, do not. I beg you." The governess pressed her lips tight and fled the room. Harriet sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands. "You must think me a coward, but there are things a family cannot endure. My sister, Edward's death, it was not as simple as fever. Yet if the truth were spoken, reputations would crumble, names would be blackened. I cannot face it." Tuppence knelt beside her. "But Harriet, silence will not protect you. It only arms whoever is tormenting you now." Harriet shivered. "Perhaps you are right. Yet the thought of the nursery, of opening that door, it is unbearable." Tommy glanced toward the east corridor. "Then let me bear it for you. A locked room, a set of mysteries, just the sort of thing to keep us occupied." He strode away with purpose, Tuppence close on his heels. The corridor was cool, shadowed, the nursery door looming at the end like a sentinel. Tommy produced a small pocket knife, its blade gleaming. "One good trick with the tumblers, and we'll see what lies within." But before he could so much as set the blade to the lock, Harriet came running, breathless, her hand clutching at his arm. "No, you mustn't." Her face was ashen, her eyes wild with fear. She seized the knife from him and pressed the key at her chain to her chest. "The nursery stays locked. It must. Do you hear me?" Tommy studied her a long moment, his soldier's instincts weighing courage against fear, truth against secrecy. Then, with deliberate calm, he closed the knife and slipped it back into his pocket. "As you wish, Lady Harriet, but one day that door will open, whether by your hand or by another's." The silence of the corridor deepened. The nursery door stood fast, its secret sealed a little longer, and the governess's secret, hinted at but unsaid, hung between them like smoke from an unseen fire. That same afternoon the rain came in sheets, rattling against the tall windows of Greystone Hall like impatient fingers demanding entrance. The gardens were reduced to a blur of dripping roses and streaming gravel paths. Indoors, the manor seemed to shrink upon itself, every corridor filled with the damp sigh of the storm. Fires were lit in every grate, but their glow did little to chase the chill that seemed to creep from the very stones. Tommy and Tuppence had claimed the library as their refuge. It was a cavernous room lined with shelves that groaned under the weight of centuries, the scent of old vellum mingling with wood smoke. A massive hearth dominated one wall, its carved mantelpiece depicting hunting scenes where hounds leapt eternally after stags. The fire within hissed as raindrops slipped down the chimney. Tuppence knelt before it, her sharp eyes roving with a patience Tommy had come to respect. She had long since abandoned embroidery and novels for the far more absorbing art of poking into corners. "You know, old girl," Tommy remarked, leafing idly through a bound volume of sermons, "most wives would be content with a warm fire and a cup of tea on a day like this." Tuppence tapped the edge of the hearthstone with a fingernail. "And most husbands would miss the loose brick under their noses. Come here and feel this." Curiosity piqued. Tommy crouched beside her. Sure enough, one of the stones set just below the grate bore faint scratches along its edge. Together they worked it free, and with a grating sigh the stone slid aside to reveal a narrow cavity. Inside lay the brittle remains of papers, blackened by soot and singed at the edges. Tuppence drew them out with care, spreading them on the rug. The handwriting was cramped but legible in places. "A diary," she breathed. "Or part of one." Tommy peered over her shoulder. "She says the child stands between me and all that should be mine. If only he were not so favoured. Well, that's cheery reading." The fragment broke off in a charred blur. Another page survived in part. If Alice had her way, she would leave everything to the boy. But what of me? What of... And then nothing. Tuppence's lips pursed. Jealousy, inheritance, and anger enough to write it down. Which of them wrote this, do you think? She considered. Harriet's brother Charles stood to gain most if Edward were out of the way, but Miss Drake might have feared dismissal once Alice died, her whole livelihood gone, and Harriet herself, could she have known something and concealed it to protect the family? Tommy gave a low whistle. That's quite the suspect list. All we're missing is the curate confessing to spiritual envy. Tuppence smiled faintly, but her eyes remained grave. She folded the fragments back together. This isn't proof, but it is motive, more than one, and whoever hid it here meant for it never to be found. The storm hammered harder against the windows, as if underscoring her words. Later, when the household gathered for tea in the drawing-room, Tuppence quietly tested their reactions. She spoke of finding some old letters in the hearth, watching each face closely. Charles's ruddy complexion darkened to near purple, and he demanded to know why strangers were rifling through family secrets. Miss Drake's hands clenched around her teacup until it rattled against the saucer. Harriet went white, murmuring that some things were best consigned to ashes. Only young Robert looked bewildered, and the curate, poor nervous Mr. Ellison, looked altogether too eager. That eagerness bore fruit an hour later. Tuppence returned to the library to fetch her gloves, only to find the curate bent over the hearthrug, the diary fragments spread before him. He started like a guilty schoolboy when she cleared her throat. "Mrs. Beresford, I beg your pardon. I merely wish to examine the script. I have a scholarly interest in handwriting, you see. Paleography, yes." His excuse tumbled out in a rush, his ears burning red. Tuppence's eyes narrowed. "Scholarly, is it? And what conclusions have you drawn?" He stammered. "Only that it speaks of jealousy, of inheritance, that, poor child, surely his death was not natural." "You speak very freely for one who only arrived as a guest," she said coolly. "Take care, Mr. Ellison. Poking into other people's grief is a dangerous occupation." He gathered the fragments clumsily, pressing them into her hands with an anxious bow. Of course, forgive me." And he fled. When Tommy returned, she recounted the incident. "A red herring if ever I saw one," he pronounced. "Our curate fancies himself a sleuth, but hasn't the backbone for murder. Still, it proves the diary stirs unease." Indeed, unease spread through the house like smoke. Harriet grew more agitated, pacing the halls, wringing her hands. Charles stormed about, declaring the whole matter absurd, but his vehemence only drew more suspicion. Miss Drake watched everything with hawk-like intensity, and Robert, poor lad, looked increasingly as though he wished himself anywhere but at Greystone. That evening, as the rain eased at last, Tommy and Tuppence sat together by the fire in their chamber. "The nursery," Tuppence said at last. "Everything points back to it. The lullaby, the footprints, the whispers, and now this diary, hinting at motive. But until we open that door, we're only circling shadows." Tommy stretched out his legs, gazing at the flames. "Harriet won't allow it, and I can't exactly storm the place with crowbars and declare myself the British police." "True," Tuppence admitted. "But secrets don't stay buried forever, even if they're hidden in hearths or behind locked doors." She rose, crossing to the window. The storm had passed, leaving the night washed and still. Yet in the east wing the nursery windows loomed, dark and silent, like watching eyes. A shiver passed through her. Somewhere in that room, she felt, lay the answer, the truth about Edward's death, about the haunting of Greystone, about the guilt that chained each member of the household. And though the door remained locked, the mystery beat like a heart behind it, steady and inexorable. That night, a storm rolled in from the moors with a rumble that shook the window panes of Greystone Hall. Lightning split the sky into harsh white slashes, and thunder followed like cannon fire. Rain hammered the leaded glass so hard it seemed determined to break through. Indoors, lamps flared uncertainly, shadows leaping and retreating along the oak-panelled corridors. It was precisely the kind of night, Tuppence thought grimly, that lent itself to revelations. And revelations, whether wanted or not, seemed to come upon them when darkness and tempest conspired. She and Tommy had just retired toward their chamber when Harriet's shrill cry rang out from the east wing. Servants scurried in confusion. Charles stormed from the billiard room, demanding to know who had disturbed his game, and Robert emerged pale from the library. All converged upon the same place, the corridor that led to the nursery. The door, long bolted and fiercely guarded, now stood slightly ajar. The iron lock dangled uselessly, its mechanism wrenched. A draught sighed from within, carrying with it the faint, musty odour of dust long undisturbed. Harriet clutched the banister for support. It cannot be! That door was locked." Tommy stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Then let's see who has unlocked it." He pushed the door open. The nursery lay revealed in a slant of lightning that illuminated the chamber for an instant, then plunged it into shadow again. Dust thickened the air, yet it swirled as if recently disturbed. Broken toys littered the carpet, their colours dulled by age. A rocking horse sagged on splintered runners, its once bright mane matted with cobwebs. Wallpaper, faded to the palest blue, peeled at the corners. Tuppence entered slowly, every sense sharpened. The air felt wrong, not merely stale but stirred, as though someone had been there moments before. "Look," she whispered, pointing to the windowsill. There lay a child's shoe, tiny, scuffed with a button missing. Harriet gasped and pressed her hand to her mouth. That belonged to Edward. I swear it was buried with him." "Yet here it lies," Tommy said grimly. He lifted it, dusted it lightly. "And not as though it's lain here untouched for years. The leather is worn, but this dust, see how lightly it coats the surface, placed here recently." The family crowded in behind them. Charles blustered. "Some servant has played a cruel trick, that is all." Miss Drake's face was unreadable, but her hands twisted together in a rare show of agitation. Robert muttered, "Why stir the past? Why can't they leave it alone?" Lightning flared again, revealing something else. On the far wall, faint but clear, a child's hand had traced lines in the dust. A crude drawing, a stick figure, its arm extended toward what might be a tree beside a rippling oval, unmistakably the lake. Tuppence felt the hair rise on her neck. "A message," she murmured, "or a memory." Harriet swayed as though about to faint. "It's wicked. To pretend to suggest." Tommy moved to the door, examining it closely. He ran a fingertip along the iron plate. "Scratches," he said. "Fresh ones. Whoever opened this lock didn't do it neatly. They forced it. This wasn't ghosts, Lady Harriet. This was human hands." The word sent a ripple through the assembled company. Panic rose like the storm outside. Servants whispered, their eyes darting fearfully. Harriet pressed against the wall as if to steady herself. Charles's face purpled with rage, and Miss Drake's lips compressed into a thin line. "Deliberate," Tommy said firmly. "Someone means to resurrect the past, and they've chosen this room as their stage." "Why?" Robert burst out. "Why torment us like this? Haven't we suffered enough?" His voice cracked and he fled the room, leaving an echo of despair behind. Tuppence watched him go, troubled. Then she turned back to the others, her gaze sweeping across them. Each face told its own story. Harriet's of fear, Charles's of anger, Miss Drake's of hidden knowledge. And behind them all, the rocking horse stood still, its glass eyes reflecting candlelight like twin watchful sentinels. The storm raged on, lightning throwing the nursery into stark relief, the cot draped in moth-eaten coverlet, the soldier doll half buried under dust, the cryptic scrawl on the wall. To Tuppence it felt less like a child's room and more like a stage set, prepared by unseen hands to deliver dread. She caught Tommy's eye. His expression said what hers dared not. This was no haunting. This was theatre, carefully staged, deliberately cruel. But for what purpose? And by whom? They left the nursery at last, Harriet insisting on locking the door again, though her hands shook so violently she could scarcely fit the key. She turned it with a shudder, whispering, "May it never open again." Yet as Tuppence glanced back down the corridor, the sense lingered that the nursery was not finished with them, that it pulsed, silent and brooding, like a heart waiting to beat once more. The morning after the forced nursery door broke with a reluctant grey light, the kind that seemed to seep rather than shine. Mist drifted low over the grounds of Greystone Hall, softening hedgerows and swallowing distant trees. From the east windows the lake was just visible, a pale sheet blurred at its edges, as though the earth itself had exhaled and forgotten to breathe back in. Tuppence stood at the window, fastening her coat, her eyes fixed on that shrouded water. "Tommy," she said quietly, "every road leads us there. The nursery drawing, the whispers, the servants' tales. Edward's death is tied to that lake." Tommy tugged on his gloves with soldierly briskness. "Then we'd best take a stroll and see what secrets it's hoarding. Country walks, after all, are supposed to be good for one's health." They set out across the sodden lawn, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The path sloped downward, flanked by ancient oaks whose branches tangled above them. The mist thickened as they approached the water, wrapping the lake in shifting veils. It was eerily quiet. Even the birds seemed reluctant to break the silence. The shoreline revealed itself gradually, reeds bent with moisture, stones slick with moss, and scattered among them, signs not of nature but of recent human presence. Tommy bent, retrieving a cigarette butt half buried in mud. He examined it with narrowed eyes. Not more than a day old. Someone's been here loitering. Tuppence's gaze shifted to a scrap of white caught in the reeds. She drew it free, a handkerchief, delicate, faintly scented with perfume that lingered even in the damp. "This is no fisherman's." "Perfume at the lakeside," Tommy mused. "Not the sort of thing a phantom would leave behind, unless we've taken to haunting with very refined taste." They continued along the bank, eyes sharp. Here and there the grass showed signs of being pressed flat, as though someone had stood often, watching the water. A narrow track led from the path toward the village, half concealed by undergrowth. Tuppence touched Tommy's sleeve. "Someone comes here regularly. This isn't a forgotten place. It's a meeting ground." Their thoughts were interrupted by a voice, sharp and carrying through the mist. "What are you doing out here?" Charles Winslow strode toward them from the direction of the hall, his coat flapping, his expression thunderous. His boots squelched in the mud, but his fury seemed untouched by weather. "Enjoying the scenery," Tommy said easily. "Picturesque spot, though one might ask the same of you." Charles's eyes flicked to the handkerchief in Tuppence's hand. "That's private property. You've no business rummaging about." "Curious," Tuppence said smoothly. "Lady Harriet told us the villagers whispered Edward drowned here. That was never the story inside the family, was it?" Charles's jaw tightened. "Gossip. Idle, cruel gossip. My nephew died of fever, as everyone knows." "Yet the governess hinted otherwise," Tuppence pressed. "She said she feared dismissal, once long ago." Something ugly twisted his face. "Miss Drake talks too much. She was dismissed once, yes, for neglect. Harriet rehired her against my judgment. If she regrets her second chance, she should hold her tongue. Tommy's eyes narrowed. You seem very anxious to protect the official story. Charles leaned close, his voice thick with anger. Because dragging up the past ruins us all. Harriet clings to shadows, Robert trembles at every creak, and you outsiders feed the fire. I won't have it. He turned on his heel and marched back toward the hall, his figure swallowed quickly by mist. Tuppence released a breath. That was not a man indifferent to suspicion. He's hiding something, Tommy. The temper gives him away. Perhaps, Tommy allowed, or perhaps he's merely a bully who can't bear questions. Still, if money troubles press, he has motive enough. Inheritance can be a dangerous temptation. They walked further along the bank until the mist parted just enough to reveal a small footbridge where the lake narrowed. A villager stood there, cap pulled low, pipe in hand. He tipped it in greeting. "Morning, ma'am, sir." Tuppence smiled politely. "Good morning. Tell me, do you often come out here?" "Now and then," the man said, voice rough with age. "To see the water. There's talk enough about it." "Talk?" Tommy prompted. The man glanced about as though afraid of being overheard. "A woman in black. Seen her, some of us have, standing yonder at dusk. By the reeds. Not close but clear enough. Long veil, like morning. And when you look again, gone." Tuppence's breath caught. "A woman in black. Recently?" "Aye. 2-3 times these past weeks. Always at dusk, always by the lake." Tommy exchanged a glance with his wife. "And what do the villagers make of it?" "Some say it's Lady Alice herself come back for her boy. Some say it's a servant lass wronged. Me, I say it's flesh and blood. Ghosts don't smoke cigarettes." He spat into the reeds and strode away, pipe trailing smoke. The mist closed behind him, leaving silence once more. Tuppence shivered. "A woman in black. Harriet's sister Alice died years ago, didn't she?" Tommy nodded slowly. "Which makes the apparition either a cruel masquerade or something worse." Tuppence said quietly, "A black veil can hide a familiar face. In this house that could be mercy or misdirection." They turned back toward the hall, the unease clinging to them like the damp mist. Inside, the tension only deepened. Harriet confronted her brother in the drawing room, her voice trembling with fury. "You think to silence Miss Drake with threats, but you will not silence me. I know you hated Alice's child. I know you envied what might have been his inheritance." Charles roared back. "You're mad, Harriet. I kept this house running when father died. You lived in comfort while I shouldered the debts. Don't talk to me of envy." Miss Drake, standing rigid by the mantel, broke in with unusual sharpness. "Both of you speak as if the boy were a ledger entry. He was a child, a sweet, frail child." Her voice cracked, and she turned abruptly, her composure broken. Robert fled again, pale and silent, his hands twisting together. Tommy drew Tuppence aside. "They're all unravelling, and someone is using that lake and perhaps that disguise to push them further." Tuppence's gaze lingered on the rain-streaked windows, beyond which the lake shimmered faintly in mist. "A woman in black," she murmured. "If she is real, she knows too much. And if she is not, then someone has chosen the most gothic mask possible." The storm of voices in the drawing room faded into uneasy silence, but the lake remained, brooding beyond the mist, as though holding in its depths the answer none dared yet to face. The evening crept in heavy with unease, the sort of twilight that seemed to press the house inward, as if Greystone itself were trying to smother its secrets. Lamps glowed faintly in the hallways, and rain pattered once more against the windows, soft but persistent. A hush lay over the household, not peace, but tension, like a bowstring drawn too tight. It was Tuppence who broke the silence. Seated in the drawing room, embroidery forgotten in her lap, she leaned toward Tommy and murmured, "We can circle this house forever, but until we force someone's hand, the truth will stay buried. We must set a snare." Tommy arched an eyebrow. "A snare, eh? Do I play the hunter or the bait?" "Both, perhaps." Her eyes glimmered. "You see, all these ghostly theatrics revolve around the past, around Edward. If someone is willing to risk staging hauntings, then they are desperate to control what we believe about his death. What if they think new evidence has come to light?" Tommy gave a low whistle. "You propose we conjure a rabbit out of a hat?" "Not a rabbit," Tuppence said firmly. "Letters. A child's letters found among the family papers. Innocent enough, yet damning if one believes a secret lies within. We shall hint such a packet exists, untouched, waiting to be read. If our phantom has flesh and blood, they will come for it. Tommy grinned. My dear girl, you'd have made an excellent general. Very well, let's draw the net. The rumour spread with subtle precision. At tea, Tommy mentioned offhandedly that he and Tuppence had come across something curious in the library cabinet. Old envelopes tied together, perhaps Edward's own childish scribbles. His tone was casual, but the effect was anything but. Harriet went pale and clasped her teacup with trembling fingers. Charles barked a laugh too loud, declaring that children's notes were of no consequence. Miss Drake dropped a stitch in her knitting, her hands fumbling awkwardly. And Robert, Harriet's son, flushed and glanced quickly toward his mother before fixing his eyes firmly on the carpet. The bait was set. That night, Tommy and Tuppence waited in the dim corridor outside the library. The rain had ceased, leaving the house wrapped in a deep silence broken only by the occasional groan of beams settling. A single lamp glowed faintly through the crack beneath the library door, as though the room itself waited in suspense. Tommy leaned against the wall, hands in pockets, his manner deceptively casual. Tuppence crouched nearby, eyes trained on the staircase. "Do you think it will work?" she whispered. "My dear, I'd wager my last cigar someone will come sniffing. The trick is whether it's the right someone." Minutes passed, stretching taut. Then, soft footsteps. Someone moved stealthily along the hall, the kind of tread that tried too hard not to be heard. A shadow slipped toward the library door. Robert Winslow. The young man paused, listening, then placed a hand on the latch. His face was taut, his movements nervous. He eased the door open and stepped inside. Tommy moved swiftly, following with silent steps, while Tuppence remained just outside, watching. Inside, the library was dark, save for the glow of dying embers in the grate. Robert crossed directly to the cabinet where the supposed letters lay. His hands trembled as he searched, pulling drawers half open, rifling among papers. "Looking for bedtime reading?" Tommy's voice was calm, almost friendly. Robert spun around, face white, eyes wide, as though caught by a searchlight. What are you doing here?" "Better question," Tommy said lightly, "is what you're doing. Hoping to find a packet of letters, perhaps?" The young man sagged against the desk, despair etched across his features. "You don't understand. I had to know. If it's true, if my family is cursed, then I must protect Mother. She cannot bear more." Tuppence entered softly, her presence gentler than Tommy's. "Robert, you must tell us what you fear. What curse? What truth?" He buried his face in his hands. The whispers in the village, the stories of the lake, the nursery left locked for all these years. If Edward's death was not natural, if someone in this family was to blame, then everything we stand upon is poisoned. My mother has carried enough sorrow. I thought, if I could find proof, perhaps I could destroy it before it destroyed her. "Proof of what?" Tuppence asked gently. "That Edward was murdered," he whispered. The word trembled in the air like an unwelcome spectre. Silence fell. The crackle of the embers was suddenly loud. Tommy regarded the young man keenly. "You truly believe one of your family guilty?" Robert's shoulders slumped. "I don't know what to believe, but every glance, every whisper suggests there is something more. And the notes to my mother, those vile notes. Someone wants the truth uncovered, or twisted. I thought if the letters existed, I could stop them." Tuppence laid a hand on his arm, her tone steady. "Robert, desperation does not equal guilt. But you must see how suspicious this looks. If you wish to protect your mother, then honesty is your only course." He lifted anguished eyes to her. "I swear to you, I have no part in these hauntings. I only sought to shield her." Tommy exchanged a glance with Tuppence. His voice softened. "Then you've nothing to fear. Your honesty clears you, though it doesn't solve our mystery." Robert sagged in relief, though shadows of worry still haunted him. "Please, keep this from my mother. She suffers too much already." The trap, though sprung, had not caught the true culprit. Robert's sincerity was plain, his actions those of a frightened son, not a calculating villain. Yet the attempt had not been wasted, for now the household was rattled, each member driven further to the surface of their secrets. At breakfast the next morning, after Robert's midnight search had come to nothing, Tommy and Tuppence watched the ripple of unease. Robert avoided everyone's gaze, though Harriet's eyes lingered on him with maternal anxiety. Charles thundered about the draught in his bedroom, his voice too loud, too forceful. Miss Drake sat stiff as ever, her mouth set, but the twitch of her fingers betrayed unrest. Even the curate, hovering awkwardly, seemed to shrink from the tension. Tuppence leaned toward Tommy. "We cleared Robert, but the real puppeteer is still at work. Every move they make sharpens the outline, even if they believe themselves hidden." Tommy buttered his toast with deliberate calm. "Then we wait, old girl. Wait and watch. They're bound to slip, and when they do, we'll be there to catch them." The nursery remained locked. The lake mist lingered, but the snare, though sprung only halfway, had tightened the circle. And in the charged silence of Greystone Hall, every glance, every whisper, every hurried footstep seemed now to ring with guilt. That evening, by arrangement, the great hall of Greystone had never looked more forbidding. Candles blazed in every sconce, their flames fighting against the cavernous shadows that clung stubbornly to the rafters. The storm outside hurled itself at the leaded windows, rattling panes and sending gusts through the old stonework. The portraits of Winslow ancestors gazed down in stern silence, as though they, too, had assembled for judgment. Tommy stood at the head of the long oak table, his stance easy but his eyes sharp. Beside him, Tuppence sat, her gloved hands folded neatly, her expression calm yet watchful. Around the table gathered the household, Lady Harriet pale and trembling, Charles glowering with barely restrained fury, Miss Drake stiff with indignation, young Robert nervously twisting a handkerchief, and Mr. Ellison, the curate introduced at the first dinner, blinking behind his spectacles. Servants lined the walls, silent as shadows, their curiosity barely disguised. "Thank you all for coming," Tommy began, his voice carrying with soldier's clarity. "I realize it is late, but the hour is fitting, for we are here not for supper nor diversion, but for truth, and truth, as we all know, waits for no man nor woman." A ripple of unease passed through the company. Tuppence's voice followed, softer but precise. "These past days have been riddled with fear, whispers in corridors, screams in the night, toys and shoes appearing where none should be. Some of you call it haunting, some call it nonsense. We call it deliberate. Every incident has been arranged, and tonight you will hear why." Charles barked a laugh. "This is absurd theatre. Harriet, why do you allow these strangers to—" "Because," Harriet cut across him, her voice rising unexpectedly, "because I must know. If there is guilt in this house, let it be spoken at last." Her outburst silenced even Charles. Tommy inclined his head. "Then let us proceed. Piece by piece the puzzle fits. First the governess. Miss Drake, you served both Lady Harriet and her sister Alice. Your silence has weighed heavily, but silence can be as loud as words." All eyes turned to the governess. She straightened her spine. "I have kept faith with my duty. My loyalty has never wavered." "Indeed," Tommy said mildly, "but loyalty can curdle into fear. You hinted once, Miss Drake, that Edward's death was not mere fever, yet you stopped short. Why?" Her hands clenched. "Because the truth would have destroyed us all. Because I could not protect the child, and I could not bear to condemn those I served. He died, yes, but the cause was tangled in quarrels, in neglect. Alice was ill herself, Harriet overwhelmed, and Charles slammed his fist on the table. "Leave my name out of this." "On the contrary," Tuppence said smoothly, "your name belongs squarely in it. The diary fragment spoke of envy, of inheritance. You, Charles, stood to gain the estate if Edward did not live, and your debts are no secret." Charles rose half from his chair, his face purple. "Lies. All of it." Tommy's gaze held steady. "And yet, you are not the phantom behind these tricks. Your temper makes you dangerous, but not subtle. Someone else has orchestrated this theatre." Murmurs spread among the servants. Harriet clutched the table edge, her knuckles white. "And then there is our curate," Tuppence continued, turning to Mr. Ellison. "You prattle of spirits, of women in black, of villagers' tales. You were caught reading the diary fragment, claiming scholarly interest. But yours is meddling, not malice. You are a red herring, Mr. Ellison, drawn here by curiosity and held here by fear." The curate flushed and stammered, I meant no harm." "We know," Tuppence said gently. "You are guilty only of nerves." Relief flickered in his eyes, though his embarrassment remained. Tommy's voice sharpened. "Which leaves us with Robert and Lady Harriet. Robert's midnight prowl for the supposed packet of letters we have already uncovered. He sought to protect his mother, not to stage hauntings. His fear was genuine, his heart true. Which brings us at last, Lady Harriet, to you." The hall fell utterly silent. Rain lashed at the windows. Harriet's lips parted, her breath shallow. "You," Tommy said steadily, "held the key to the nursery all these years. You insisted it remain locked. You screamed when others tried to enter. And now, you are the one who planted the toy soldier, the child's shoe, the drawings on the wall. You are the one who whispered lullabies in the corridor and staged the phantom by the lake." "No!" Harriet's cry tore through the hall. "You cannot!" But Tuppence's voice cut in, calm and unyielding. "We can. For only you knew which toys were buried with Edward. Only you had access to his belongings. Only you could recreate what would strike deepest fear." Harriet sank back, trembling violently. Tommy pressed on. "Why? Because long ago, when you were young, your sister's child died. Not by fever alone, but by accident. An accident born of neglect, perhaps even a moment's anger. You covered it, Lady Harriet. You sealed the nursery, buried the truth, and told the world a tale of illness. You thought the past buried, but conscience has teeth. When whispers arose, when the diary fragment came to light, you panicked. You staged these hauntings to terrify others, to drive them away from the truth." The words fell like hammer blows. The servants gasped. Charles surged to his feet, then froze, as though struck silent. Miss Drake's face crumpled, a sob escaping despite her efforts. Robert stared in horror at his mother. Harriet pressed her hands to her ears. "No, no, you do not understand. I was barely more than a girl. Alice was weak. She left the child to me. He cried endlessly. I shook him, only once, only to hush him. And then he was still. I did not mean, oh God, I did not mean." Her confession poured out, ragged and broken, filling the hall with its rawness. "I told father he had taken fever. He believed me. We buried him with his toys. We locked the nursery. I thought the silence would protect us. But it grew year by year into a shadow that smothered me. And when those notes came, when whispers stirred again, I thought if I made it seem the house was haunted, people would fear ghosts, not the truth." Her voice cracked into sobs. Tuppence's eyes were steady, though compassion flickered there. "The truth, Lady Harriet, cannot be buried with stone and key. It walks, it whispers, until it is faced." Harriet bowed her head upon the table, shoulders shaking. Charles muttered, shaken, "My God, all these years, and we thought—" Miss Drake's tears flowed freely. "I knew something was wrong. I suspected, but I dared not speak. I failed him too." Robert's voice trembled. "Mother, why did you not tell me?" Harriet lifted her face, streaked with tears. "Because I could not bear to see your eyes upon me. Because I wanted you to have a legacy untainted by my sin." The hall held silence again, broken only by Harriet's weeping. At last Tommy spoke, voice grave. "The law may take little interest in an accident long past, but truth has its own judgment. The nursery is no longer locked, Lady Harriet. Its ghosts have been laid bare. Whether you can live with them is for you to decide." Tuppence rose, her gaze sweeping the assembly. "The haunting of Greystone was not by spirits, but by conscience, and now that conscience has spoken, this house may find peace at last." Harriet was led away by servants, her sobs fading into the corridor. Charles slumped heavily in his chair. Miss Drake wept quietly. Robert sat stunned. The curate murmured a prayer under his breath. Tommy and Tuppence stood together, side by side, the storm still raging beyond the walls. "Another case closed," Tommy said softly, though his eyes were sombre. Tuppence nodded. "Closed, but not neatly tied. Some wounds never mend, but at least truth has been spoken." They turned toward the great doors of the hall, leaving behind the echoes of confession and the whisper of rain. The tribunal of Greystone was over, and the house, though scarred, might at last begin to heal. The storm had broken by morning. Sunlight spilled across the lawns of Greystone Hall. startling in its brightness after nights of thunder and shadow. The air smelled of wet earth and roses, sharp and clean, as though the world itself had been rinsed. Inside the house, a quiet hung that was almost reverent. No whispers of lullabies, no sudden screams. The manor, long wrapped in tension, seemed to exhale at last. Servants moved about with lighter steps, their voices hushed but relieved. At Lady Harriet's instruction at first light, the heavy doors of the nursery stood open, ajar for the first time in decades. Tuppence paused there, her hand resting lightly on the frame. Sunlight streamed in through the tall windows, falling across the faded wallpaper and broken toys. The rocking horse no longer loomed in menace, but stood revealed as nothing more than wood and paint, worn and harmless. Dust motes danced in the golden light like tiny freed spirits. "It looks different," Tuppence murmured. Tommy came to stand beside her, slipping his hands into his pockets with soldierly ease. "Everything does in daylight, even ghosts, it seems." She smiled faintly. "Not ghosts, secrets. They always claw to the surface eventually, whether one wills it or not." "Which is precisely why," Tommy declared, "I intend never again to stay in a country house with locked nurseries, secret compartments, or any room that fancies shutting itself. One can't be expected to sleep soundly under such conditions." Tuppence laughed, a sound that lightened the air further. "You'll have to settle for seaside boarding houses then. I hear they're rarely haunted." "Excellent. Ghosts dislike sea air." Their shared smile carried both relief and fondness. Downstairs, the household was stirring in the wake of confession. Charles kept to his rooms, bluster deflated, his footsteps heavy across the floorboards. Robert hovered protectively near his mother's chambers, though Harriet herself remained withdrawn, attended by physicians summoned hastily from the village. Whether she would ever recover from the burden of her own words was a question none dared voice aloud. Miss Drake, the governess, stood at the door of the drawing-room as the Beresfords descended. Her stiff carriage had softened, the perpetual iron line of her mouth trembled. "I am leaving," she said quietly. "There is no place for me here now, but I wish to thank you, both, for forcing into light what I could not." Tuppence touched her arm gently. "It was never yours to bear alone. Do not carry guilt that is not yours." The governess's eyes brimmed, though she quickly blinked the tears away. "Perhaps in time I shall believe that. Good day to you, Mr. and Mrs. Beresford." With a final nod, she turned and walked down the steps, her figure growing smaller against the blaze of morning, her long-held burden lifted, if not yet wholly gone. By afternoon, word had spread through the village. At the post office, the bakery, and along the lanes, whispers passed from mouth to ear. Greystone was free at last. No more footsteps in empty corridors, no more songs in the night. The nursery door, once bolted against dread, now stood open to sun and air, and the house seemed lighter for it. Some spoke of Lady Harriet with pity, some with censure, but all agreed the Winslow family, once cloaked in shadow, would never again inspire tales of haunting. Tommy and Tuppence prepared to depart that evening. Their suitcases were fetched down, their coats brushed and ready. The hall was quieter than when they had first arrived, the anxious grandeur of welcome replaced by weary gratitude. At the great door Robert met them, pale but steadier than before. He shook Tommy's hand firmly, then turned to Tuppence. "I owe you both more than I can say. You gave us truth, however bitter. Perhaps now we may find peace." "Peace," Tuppence said gently, "comes when secrets cease to fester. Guard it well." He bowed his head in acknowledgement, then stepped back as the butler swung open the heavy doors. Outside, their motorcar waited. Evening light gilded the wet gravel, the last remnants of mist lifting from the lawns. The lake lay still, its surface unbroken, no phantom figure haunting its edge. As they settled into the motorcar, Tommy stretched his legs with satisfaction. "Well, old thing, another puzzle solved, though I must say it lacked certain comforts. Fewer cocktails, more corpses, or nearly so." Tuppence arched an eyebrow. "You'd prefer a livelier murder." "Merely one that doesn't involve drafty nurseries and women in black. Give me a straightforward jewel theft any day." She laughed softly, leaning back as the carriage jolted forward. "And yet, Tommy, admit it, you enjoyed yourself, just a little." He considered, then smiled. "Perhaps, but next time, I choose the destination, preferably somewhere warm, with less chance of being serenaded by phantom lullabies. The road curved, carrying them away from Greystone Hall. Behind them, the manor stood tall against the fading light, no longer brooding but solemn, a house that had confessed its sins. The nursery windows reflected the sunset, no longer shuttered in shadow but open to the world. As the carriage rolled toward the horizon, Tuppence rested her head lightly against Tommy's shoulder. Another shadow lifted, another secret unearthed. I wonder sometimes how many more puzzles lie waiting in these quiet English lanes. Tommy gave a low chuckle. Knowing our luck, old girl, every lane hides one, and we shall find them, whether we want to or not. She smiled, eyes on the road ahead, then let us be ready. And so they drove on, their laughter mingling with the hum of the engine, leaving behind a house unburdened at last and carrying with them the certainty that wherever secrets lay hidden, Tommy and Tuppence would be there to uncover them.